All right, y'all. We are shifting gears again. We've been talking about urban spaces, infrastructure, transportation, sort of built, largely focusing on the built environment. We're going to kind of refocus back on more of the natural environment for the next few lectures here and trying to think about how we utilize the natural environment, how we impact the natural environment, and the services and benefits we get from the environment that basically make life possible, really. And so we're going to talk today about ecosystem services. We're going to talk about managing biodiversity in the next lecture, and kind of wrap up this section focusing on how we manage ecosystem services. So a lot of this stuff is probably going to be somewhat of a review for you if you're taking ESM 105 or you've taken ESM 105 environmental studies. You've had maybe classes like this in high school or whatever. So I'm going to kind of blast through the first part of this, and then we will focus more on the services part of ecosystems later in this lecture. All right, so moving along here. What is an ecosystem? It is the biological community and its physical environment. And so you can see from the pictures here, right, the ecosystem is actually created, or the foundation of the ecosystem is this oil rig, and the underwater components of the rig, the legs and so forth that go down into the water, actually provide a framework for natural life to accumulate. So the legs of the oil rig actually kind of serve as an artificial reef. And so you get, corals that form along there that build up on there that then attracts other forms of life. So you get octopi and whatever these things are, and little fishes and so forth. And so you start to see actually the creation of an ecosystem around the artificial framework of the oil rig. So a pretty cool example of how the natural living features, the biotic components and the abiotic components, the non-living features of the environment can work together to create an ecosystem. And so looking at the definitions, the abiotic components are those non-living aspects of an ecosystem. So things like rocks and soil, or at least the non-living components of soil, water, other things like that that are necessary to provide habitat, provide resources for the living components of the ecosystem, which are the biotic components. So those are the plants and the animals that live within an ecosystem. So those are the two primary components of an ecosystem, and they work together. So if you change one element, whether living or non-living, of an ecosystem, you will actually influence other elements of that ecosystem. So for example, if you take out wolves from an ecosystem, what happens is by removing that predator, you start to see an increase in rabbits and deer and other species that are prey animals to the wolves. And as those species increase, they eat more of the vegetation. And as they eat the vegetation, that can contribute to erosion of the soil because they're removing the plants that hold soil in place. And that erosion of the soil washes down into neighboring waterways, changes the characteristics of those waterways, increases the turbidity and so forth. And so you can see how changing a biotic component by removing wolves can actually have a fundamental change on the abiotic components of the soil and the water through erosion caused by increased herbivores eating the stuff, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And within the ecosystem, there are relationships that are formed. So we have food chains, which basically herbivores eat plants, get consumed by omnivores and carnivores. And when everything dies, it gets decomposed by detritivores. So you have, some animals like hawks and coyotes, bears, rats, those kinds of things that actually consume, dead things, right? Different bugs and stuff as well as fungi that actually help to decompose things that die. So you have, just like the Lion King says, the circle of life, right? things get eaten by other things, then die and get eaten by other things. And within ecosystems too, you have different food chains that connect to form food webs. And question to think about: why is the pyramid the right shape to think of when considering food systems? You can pause it and think about that if you want to, or just continue on. And it's because the herbivores have to consume a lot more of the plants to produce the calories that are then consumed by the carnivores. So, you know, cows eat a lot of stuff to make the meat that we then consume. So we eat much less meat than the cows do grass, right? So that conversion from grass to calories is much less efficient than the conversion of meat to calories. So as you work your way up the food chain, it becomes narrower. And what are some things that can disrupt the relationships within ecosystems? Picture here's a great example, right? Pollution. So as we put more pollution into the environment, that's going to change food systems, food food chains, food webs. All of those things get affected by how we utilize the environment. If we're there's a big concern now with the acidification of the oceans because oceans have been a sink for carbon dioxide that we're emitting. And as the carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans, they tend to become more acidic. And that acidification is making it harder for shells to form. So creatures that rely on calcite shells are finding it harder to make those shells. It's affecting coral reefs, leading to coral bleaching and other issues. So we're beginning to impact our environment pretty significantly because of pollution. Species loss, when you remove a species from an ecosystem, that can have pretty significant roll-on effects that change the characteristics of that ecosystem. So lots of things disrupt ecosystems. All right, so the biosphere is the collective term for all of the Earth's ecosystems. So it's basically everything contained within the envelope of the Earth's atmosphere. All right, that's our biosphere. All right, so shifting gears now, we kind of hopefully have a basic understanding of what an ecosystem is. Let's start talking about ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are those things that Mother Nature does for us that we don't have to necessarily pay for. So kind of the most fundamental is that the environment produces oxygen. Plants put off oxygen, we breathe the oxygen, we survive, right? The hydrologic system, movement of water, is a service that we don't have to pay for, right? We have fresh water available to us through these ecosystem services. Soil production, pollination, we'll talk about that in a bit. All of these things are services that nature provides for us that we don't have to deal with. And one of the challenges when we talk about managing ecosystem services is that much of this is part of the global commons. So the idea of the atmosphere, right? Air circulates around the globe. It doesn't respect jurisdictions or country borders or any of those things. So when we talk about issues of air pollution, CO2 pollution, climate change, those kinds of things, right? That's a global problem. We all impact it. So it's really hard to manage because it is a global issue, right? Overfishing in the oceans, much of the oceans are not managed by any particular country. So there's no real control over how much fishing is done out in the uncontrolled areas. So it's, this idea of a global commons has to be managed for all, but there's no controlling authority to do so. So this idea of externalities are the costs and impacts of our behavior that affect everyone, but we don't actually pay those costs. So easiest example I can think of that is when you drive a car, right? You are increasing congestion for everyone, right? Everyone is impacted by all of us driving, right? You're pumping out CO2 and other air pollutants from your tailpipe, right? So all of those things are impacting the larger community, but you're not actually paying the costs associated with those negative impacts, right? So we get the value of having a car and driving it, but we're not paying the actual full cost of that behavior. So, another example is carbon, because carbon in the United States is not regulated as a pollutant. Industry businesses can emit carbon without any kind of regulation, fee, cost associated with emitting that carbon, despite the impact that that has on climate change and so forth. So, in the idea of tragedy of the commons, we've talked about to where the negative impacts of behavior are shared across the entire community, but the benefits of behavior accrue to the individual. So if we have a pasture that's used by the entire community, me as an individual I as an individual am going to maximize my benefit by putting as many cows as I can on that common pasture, because even though that many cows will overeat the grass and ruin the pasture, I will benefit because I can sell more cows than someone else, right? So we try to maximize our individual benefit at the cost of the larger community, because the costs are shared, the rewards are individualized. So ecosystem services are, again, those things that we get from the environment that we don't have to pay for. If you're interested, that link is a good one that provides a nice 6-minute summary of ecosystem services. I'm not going to click on it just because I don't want to take that time and make this file even bigger than it already is. But we're going to go through each of these different services that we get. So supporting, regulating, provisioning, and cultural services. And so those are all different kinds of things we get from the environment around us, and keeping those things in balance and in harmony is super important, right? If we want to maintain sustainability, we need to make sure that we are extracting from our ecosystems only what those ecosystems can bear. So provisioning services, what are some of the provisioning services we get from nature? Things like fresh water, energy, so solar, wind, non-renewables, energy. So coal is something that the world has created for us. Oil is something the world has created for us, or not for us, but it's created, and we can utilize those resources to our benefit. And so they're just there for us to go get, right? We can't make coal. I guess we could make coal, but it would take more energy to produce coal than we would actually get from the coal that we produce. Fisheries, oxygen, timber, medications, right? We actually get a lot of our medicines from the environment. So there's different species that provide different things. Aspirin came from the bark of the willow tree. So we can figure out what those compounds are that are in that natural thing, and then we extract them and start to synthesize them and produce them ourselves. But again, the original compounds that we use for medication oftentimes come from nature, and it's services that nature has provided without any work from us. So some of the challenges to provisioning services, sorry, the slide's kind of janky here. Overharvesting is a big one, right? So if we're taking out more from the resource than it can reproduce, we are overharvesting. Loss of habitat, as we are transitioning, as we're building more urban environments, more suburban environments, we're taking out habitat, we're taking out forests and other lands that have natural ecosystems on them, replacing them with artificial ecosystems. As we consume more farmland and transform space into agricultural lands, again, we're changing those habitats, changing the ecosystem services that are provided by those lands. And of course, pollution, right? As we pollute our environment, we change ecosystems, we reduce their viability, we reduce their capacity to function healthily, and that begins to negatively impact ourselves. So regulating services, things like water regulation, filtration, runoff, storm management, wetlands are an enormous ecosystem service that we benefit from. So wetlands serve as a buffer along coastlines from coastal storms like hurricanes. They also are a great way to filter and clean water. So when water flows through wetlands, a lot of the gunk gets filtered out, and we have cleaner water at the end of that process. So those are significant services that we get from the ecosystem. Climate regulation, so CO2 absorption, temperature moderation, wind barriers, right? All those things are benefits we get. Mitigating hazards, we talked about wetlands, barrier islands. Those can absorb the power and storm surge from hurricanes and so forth. And we also get disease regulation. So long, cold winters help kill off diseases and pests that otherwise would affect humans and affect our ecosystems. So one of the challenges that many areas of the country are facing now, because winters are shortening and becoming warmer, we're actually seeing greater beetle infestations in many of our pine forests, like in the Rocky Mountains. And those beetles that used to die off every winter because the winters were long, hard, and cold, now are surviving, reproducing, and taking out forests, which increases the potential for wildfire and the harm that can come from that. So you kind of get into that vicious cycle to where these hazards kind of build upon one another and become more damaging and dangerous over time. Supporting services are things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, decomposition. So when things die, they go away pretty quickly, right? They decompose because of the critters and bacteria that consume dead things, the fungi and so forth that consume dead things. It's why you don't see lots of dead animals around, because they get consumed pretty quickly. Pollination is another important service we get from the environment. And so pollination is estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar service that we get from bees. And you've probably heard about the issue with bees, that bees are dying off, and it could potentially be an enormous catastrophe if bees die off because of the pollination services we get. It would have an enormous impact on our agricultural system if bees go away, because they do so much work for us just in their everyday living. So super important services that we get that we don't actually pay for. And cultural services really kind of are about human use of the environment. So things like historic preservation, tourism, recreation, all of those are cultural services. We benefit from having spaces to go. And as we're all cooped up in our homes right now and maybe don't have as much access as we used to being outside in the natural environment, some of that becomes a little bit more meaningful to us as we recognize what we're missing by not being able to go hike and do all those things that we want to do as much. So when we talk about ecosystem services in the natural environment, there's a couple of terms to understand: consumptive versus non-consumptive use. And consumptive use is basically using the resource in a way that may or may not be sustainable. We're actually taking from the resource. So timber harvesting, oil and coal extraction, soil depletion, fishing. We're actually consuming the resource, and it can be done sustainably, right? We can fish in a sustainable manner to make sure that we leave enough fish in the ocean to reproduce for the next time we need to go fishing. When we harvest timber, we can again cut down the right number of trees so that they can naturally reproduce themselves and recreate the environment that we're changing as we harvest those trees. So non-consumptive use extracts value without removing a resource. So that tends to be things like recreation. You know, when you go hiking or mountain biking through an area, you're not really consuming that area, right? You're not taking it with you when you leave. So you get to enjoy it, and it's still there, still the same way it was when the next person comes through. So it's a non-consumptive use. And it can be used kind of indefinitely in that manner. So pollinators are a non-consumptive use, right? Because the bees are out there doing their work, pollinating plants for us, and we're not consuming them. We're not, we're not eating bees or anything like that. They're providing that service for us. We're benefiting from it. They're benefiting because they're getting the nectar they need to make their honey or whatever. All right, so when we think about these ecosystem services, we need to think about how we value them. And so our economy, as you can imagine, is based on monetary value. We define things by the financial value it produces. And so a resource is only considered valuable if it can be exchanged for money or other need, right? So trees, in this definition, trees only matter because we can cut them down, turn them into lumber, and get money for selling that lumber, right? There's little attention paid to the aesthetic value of trees, the other services, the oxygen creation that trees provide, all of those other services, because we can't really financially define them. Oftentimes their values overlooked. But there is, and many people have this moral or ethical value that things have a right to exist just because they exist. And so as humans, because of our capacity to impact the environment and change the environment in such significant ways, we have a moral obligation to think about that and manage the environment in a sustainable manner. So many ecosystem services are not quantifiable, or it's really hard. I mean, how do you put a value on oxygen production, right? Per acre of trees. It's not something that's very easy to do. But there are some efforts. Some economists have tried to put a value on ecosystem services. And again, it's because within the value system that we have, being able to put dollars to something is going to make it more approachable and more accessible for people to understand if we can have some kind of financial definition to these services that we get. So one recent study put the overall value of ecosystem services at $125 to $145 trillion, which, if you put that in perspective, the entire global economy is about $80 trillion. So the services we get from nature at no cost to ourselves, really, is greater than the entire global economy as it's currently defined. So certainly something worth considering. How we think about these services that we oftentimes do take for granted. So for example, bee pollination is about $217 billion estimate. That's basically how much it would cost to get people out there to pollinate plants that bees and other pollinators do it now for free, right? So if we had to have someone out there, the example, the video, I'm not going to show y'all again, you can link to it if you want to, is essentially people in China, because the bees have been killed off by overuse of pesticides. Pear farmers in China are literally climbing into their trees and manually pollinating their trees. So, taking little swabs, going into a particular flower to get the pollen, taking it over to another flower, and pollinating that flower by hand. And you can imagine the level of work that is. So to try and reproduce what bees do in the United States, given how much they pollinate for us, $217 billion, which is a huge amount of money. So just something to consider when we think about these ecosystem services. And today is a quickie, so y'all can take advantage of that. We will talk at the next lecture, we'll talk about biodiversity, and then we'll move on to how we can better manage our ecosystem services. Have a great day. I will talk to y'all next time.